Okay, we left off last time in Matthew chapter 10 and talking about kind of the hard road really in following Jesus. And Jesus goes on in verse 24 of chapter 10 saying, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master." And when he's talking about that, he's referencing this in connection with like the next verse where it says, "It is enough for the teacher that it is enough for the disciple that he become as the teacher, and the slave is his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, or Beelzebub, depending on translation, how much more the members of the household?" So he's saying he's been called a demon, and if you rise up to the level of your master, you should expect like treatment. And so here we have Jesus really explaining kind of discipleship is going to be difficult. If you're going in for this to this relationship with Jesus with an expectation that everything will be just fine, you need to evaluate it, count the cost. Verse 28, he says, "Do not fear those who kill the body." And that's, we've got to come to that place where we're not afraid of those who just can end our temporal existence, because many will threaten that. If you truly walk in the ways of the Lord, and especially in certain societies, you're going to be subject to this. He said, "But do not fear those who can kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." And so what Jesus is saying here, you really need to have a true reverence and fear of God. Not so much just, it's like we want to get along with people, we want to please people, we don't want to stir up trouble, all of those kind of things, but there's going to be times when truth is going to stir up trouble, where discipleship and following Jesus will stir up trouble. And so he said we've got to overcome the fear factor. And so we get to the end of this chapter in chapter 10, and it says, "Everyone therefore," verse 32, "who shall confess me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever shall deny me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven." This is a summary here of this kind of statement here, the whole lead up he's had here, and the difficulty of being a disciple. And he says, you know what, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father. These are the kind of verses that make us kind of quake, that make us sit back and think, am I really walking in the kind of relationship that I need to with the Lord? And so there's other things left here in the end of chapter 10. And what I'm having a problem with in this whole thing is that there's so much information, it's hard to just overview it. I find myself wanting to dig in and get into each one just a little bit more. But we're going to skip ahead to chapter 11. In chapter 11, we introduced to John the Baptist. He's in prison. He sends some of his disciples to ask Jesus a question. And in verse 1 it says, "And it came about that when Jesus had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now when John in prison heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the expected one, or shall we look for another?'" And so when he's talking here, expected one, a coming one, they're talking about the Messiah. They're talking about, in the Greek, who would be the Christ. And John's disciples are sent to ask the question, are you the coming one? Are you the expected one? Now, remember, John was Jesus' cousin. Their moms, they were pregnant together for a period of time. John jumped in his mother's womb when his mom saw Jesus' mom coming. I mean, it was like there's history, and I'm sure they heard the story of the Immaculate Conception, that Mary was a virgin, and when she conceived Jesus. And yet here, he's at this point, he's in prison. And of course, prison can do some things to you, I guess. You're in there and thinking, what in the world? My cousin's like the Messiah, and I'm in prison? I mean, can't you do something? I thought you're supposed to rule the world. And so there could come questions at this point. And he says, are you the expected one, or should we look for someone else? And there's other implications on this. In that culture, in that time, there were some that even believed there would be two Messiahs. One that would be called Ben Joseph, another Ben David. Kind of Ben Joseph would be the king of peace, and Ben David would be the warrior, conquering king. And so We see those kind of pictures in Zechariah. We see that both of those are talked about, and or you've got even in Micah, you got one born in a manger. Come on, peaceful, born in a manger, king. And then you got one in Daniel riding in the clouds in power. And so they're looking in the Old Testament of the coming Messiah. There was kind of a conflict in understanding who this Messiah would be. They were looking for a ruler, someone that would overthrow Rome. But then you see these other aspects of this shepherd type ruler, of this peaceful type ruler, and that kind of thing. So we don't know exactly what John's question was. Was he saying are there two Messiahs that are coming? Are you one of them? Or is he just saying, are you the one Messiah that's coming? All we know is that the response was this. Jesus answered and said to them, verse 4, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." These are even indications of, in Isaiah when it says the Spirit of the Lord was upon me, to do these things. Some of these things are what's included in there. So that Spirit of the Lord upon him, it seems like that anointed one, the Christ, the Messiah. So what Jesus is saying is just tell him what's happening. The blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the gospel's being preached to those. And then he adds this verse in verse 6, this statement, "And blessed is he who keeps from stumbling over me." I think Jesus picked up a little bit on John here, what's going on with John. I think John was stumbling a little bit over this. Here, yeah, you're this all-powerful Messiah, and I'm in prison. And so Jesus said, "Blessed is he, and blessed is he who does not stumble over me." So we see that added on there. So Jesus, after that, in verses 7 through 19 in chapter 11, kind of gives John a tribute, and he honors John among men as just such a great prophetic voice in that time. And not only in that time, but for all time, John was an amazing prophetic voice. And then Jesus goes on and talks about the cities that have seen all these miracles in this area. The cities that have seen him coming, have been there and seen Jesus' actual ministry. And he actually rebukes these cities and say, you're going to be worse off than Sodom in the day of judgment because of the things that you've seen. It'll be more tolerable for Sodom than it'll be for you. And, so it's quite a rebuke for these cities that saw Jesus' miracles and saw his ministry there. And he ends the chapter 11 with some really powerful verses, ones that have been known and loved throughout history for a long time. And Jesus in 25 through 30 of chapter 11, he kind of offers a prayer to the Father, but then he turns to the people and he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light." So Jesus ends this chapter with these comforting words. And it's interesting, he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." This, once again, here we got this contrast that we even see in this, and that this ruling king, this coming king, this one who rides in the clouds in Daniel, this one whose kingdom is forever, that's pronounced in the Old Testament, that's coming. He says he's gentle and humble in heart. One of the things that we see throughout the scriptures and the judgments that come upon the earth, we've mentioned in the Old Testament so often what it's related to is it's judging arrogance and pride. And what's left in that we see is this: learn of Jesus. He's gentle and humble. He's meek and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. His yoke is easy and his load is light. And so that's kind of our measuring stick when we're looking at this. Are we carrying the Lord's load? If we're carrying his load, he says his yoke is easy and his load is light. And so if you're carrying something that seems to be way too heavy for you, the chances are you're carrying your own load or some other load and not his load.